My name is Dr. Aletha Maybank. I am Chief Health Equity Officer, Senior Vice President at the American Medical Association. Just an honor to be here. Honor to be in community with people that I haven't seen in like 2 years, 3 years. I don't know how long it's been. And friends from my career also here, and it's just awesome to be in each other's space. So I'm valuing the time in many ways. So I'm going to first read a land acknowledgement because I think that's important to the conversation. That's actually been going on all day today in terms of the practice of centering the voices, the people, the ideas, the expertise of those who have been most impacted, burdened, marginalized, colonized, in this context of this country. And so this is, and it wasn't a necessarily easy go, but it was a push and an important go for us at the American Medical Association, which I'll talk about clearly in a second. But the importance of putting this forward, not everybody understood, and I think that's the kind of the challenge and opportunity that we have in this work. And how do we convince the institutions, oftentimes that we're working in, that these are the right things to do. These are the way we show up to support people's dignity, and that to say that we care, and that these are human beings, and that we love our people and each other. So here it goes. Land and labor acknowledgement. We acknowledge that we are all living off the taken ancestral lands of indigenous peoples for thousands of years. We acknowledge the extraction of brilliance, energy, and life for labor forced upon people of African descent for more than 400 years. We celebrate the resilience and strength that all indigenous people and descendants of Africa have shown in this country and worldwide. And we carry our ancestors in us, and we are continually called to be better as we lead this work. And, clearly this is not to say, and I usually have to say this disclaimer, I don't think I really particularly do with this audience, but I'll still say it. This is not to say that many folks have not had contributions to the foundation and formation of this country, but it is critical that we acknowledge who has historically, again, been most marginalized, colonized, racialized, all of the eyes that are here. So thank you for listening and sharing with me in that. So I have a wonderful panel with me today, and a group of leaders as well. I like to call my friends and colleagues co-conspirators. As we do this work, a lot of times in our institutions, right, there's a lot of inside-outside strategy to many of our successes. And, I looked the whole way over there to the end as he's looking to the ground so humbly to Dr. Joseph Betancourt, who, you look really, really young, and I'm sure you really, really are, which means you started out really, really young. That may be not a fully appropriate comment, but I'm going to say it anyway, because people say it about me too. But I just remember reading his work. And this is when I started, my first role as the founding director of Office of Minority Health in Long Island in, I think it was 2006. And I reached out to, because I'm new to this space. A lot of people were new to this space, but he had already been, he was there, publications, leadership, voice. And so I just want to recognize, as we talk about ancestors and those who come, before us and those who we look up to, Dr. Betancourt has absolutely been that, I think, in this space of justice and equity in our institutions of health. So I acknowledge you and your leadership. He is at MassGeneral. Well, I'll let him, he's going to introduce himself in many ways. And then Juliet Choi. It's the first time I'm meeting you in person, but it's an honor because I have heard about you, which is awesome. Who is president of the Asian and Pacific Islander American Health Forum. I'm going to have her say a few more words, as well as Guillermo Cecchi. Did I say that? Did I get it right? Close. Okay. Principal research at IBM, and leads the efforts there. So what I would like to do, this conversation is focused on highlighting the prevalence of racial biases that have been embedded in our algorithms, but really, I think throughout our data systems and the way we do our work, from design to the methods to the interpretation, and how they can misrepresent our needs and the realities of racialized populations, again, marginalized, and all the things that I typically mention, and create undue harm. But also exploring what does it really mean to center communities that have been historically marginalized. How have you done it in practice? And what are kind of the consequences I want to kind of talk about when we talk about this work, because it's almost the jargon again of in the way that social determinants of health language is jargon. Folks are saying we need to center. Well, okay, but they're not thinking about the unintended consequences, I think, oftentimes, but also the opportunities and what does that really mean to be committed to centering people, ideas, voices, etc. So I would like to dig a little bit into that. So first, what I would like to hear is just can you briefly each describe or discuss your passion and your efforts that you've been working on, and through that conversation, describe, because not everybody's on the same page, but how you have seen racial bias show up in the context of algorithms and research and data, and how that has potentially caused harm to people that we know. So Dr. Betancourt, I'm going to start with you over there.
Right. And first, thank you for those kind words. It's an honor. It's a gift that you give me by saying, that I've been at this for a while, which I appreciate. And I too want to pass it forward. People who are mentors of mine, like Jack Geiger, people like Count Gibson, people, certainly like Michael Bird, Linda Clayton, who, on whose shoulders I stand. And I guess that's our journey, and that's our message, right? That we have to honor those whose shoulders we stand on, and also have the humility to not act like we discovered fire, right? Like, Jack Geiger was talking about prescribing food in the 50s in the bayou, right? And now we got religion around social determinants. So I think it's important. We see this nowadays where everybody's, found the shiny new thing. And I think being thoughtful historians and acknowledging that people have been at this for a while is really important. So, my journey here really comes from a deep personal place. So I'm from Puerto Rico, grew up in a bilingual, bicultural home, was interpreter for my grandmother when I was a kid, obviously the product of a lot of very real and deep sacrifices for my parents to give me a chance to even dream about getting into the health professions. In my genes come organize and come kind of this idea of caring for those who are vulnerable. So I those are all thanks that I give to be in the privileged place that I am today. And I think very early on in my career, got a chance to realize that there wasn't a lot of people that looked like me and like us, that we were caring for a lot of people, who looked like me and like us, and that in subtle and in very direct ways, every day, bias and racism was playing out, in sometimes in very egregious ways and things we heard as we were trained, to more subtle ways like today, where we, after the pandemic, talking about, kind of how race plays into bias, that, we come to this realization that the pulse oximeter, something we've been used to triage people into kind of the ICUs during the COVID pandemic, doesn't work well on people with dark skin. Right? And the same thing we could say of the types of things we thought about certain medications not working for certain people, the race calculation for renal function. I mean, these things kind of get embedded into the psyche, and then nobody challenges the evidence around them, and then they just carry forth. So the good news is, I think now, and this will be part of the conversation, we are challenging them. We are just saying we want due process for this evidence. And how does race play out in a lot of these different ways in which bias is in our artificial, could be and has been built into artificial intelligence, into devices, into therapeutics, into medications. And we have to be good students of our past to prevent this from just continuing to reify in the future. And I think that's the way it's presented throughout my career. And I think the good news is that we've reached a point where we're being a lot more disciplined, a lot more deliberate about rooting that out with due process. And I'll tell you, change is hard. People don't like change. If you've been doing something for the same way for a long time and you question it all of a sudden, it's why are you questioning this? And I think we see a lot of those themes in all of this work. So I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you for that. Juliet?
Well, it's kind of hard going after first the good doctor here and then the good doctor here. I did want to briefly acknowledge Joseph here, if I may. I'm one of those recovering attorneys. I'm from Washington, D.C. And I had the privilege of serving 5 years in the Obama administration. My first 2.5, I was the chief of staff at the Office for Civil Rights at HHS. And on our very short list of people to know and call and get to know and ask a lot of questions was this good doctor right here. And we were really trying to figure out how can we leverage medical knowledge, the national experts, to create a civil rights agenda at HHS. And I see one of my HHS former alums here, Juliet, in the audience as well. Let's see, my personal introduction, if I may. I'm the daughter of South Korean immigrants. My folks came to the US in the 1960s. And fast forward, in addition to being a recovering attorney, I still want to figure out what I want to be when I grow up. So if you look at my bio, I've had sort of an interesting journey. But when it comes to healthcare, the real big passion for me is I had the honor, privilege, and responsibility of being the caretaker to my two younger sisters when I was in college. And one sister had a really bad fever, and I didn't know what to do. So I called my university emergency room and just asked, well, students go to the emergency room, can I just bring my sister? And the first question I got was, do you have insurance? And as a 19, 20-year-old, I knew the words. English is my first language. But I was like, how do I answer that? And that actually began a journey of, wow, I am privileged enough to be at this wonderful university, and I am having just such a hard time navigating care for my sister. And at the moment, she just had a really, really bad fever. So I think that was the beginning of the fire in the belly, in terms of health advocacy. The Health Forum, we are the oldest and largest health advocacy organization serving Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders. And I will say, with our conversation today, I think it's important to highlight the issues, but I also want to acknowledge so many loved ones that we've all lost. I think especially the elders from the Black community, the Latino, Hispanic communities, the indigenous communities, Asian, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islanders, and so many more. Because when we lose elders, what I think is like unnecessarily, we lose so much of our history. In terms of some of our advocacy work, we as an organization, I would say the two most important things I can help our organization do, and it's really two sides of the same coin. Number one, it's policy advocacy in Washington, D.C. Certain administrations, it's easier. Other administrations, it's a little bit more challenging. The flip side of that coin is community empowerment, community narrative. And as you may know, the AA and HPI communities were very, very diverse. But it's really important in all of your experiences, personally and professionally, I think being able to bring that narrative forward of both the beauty, diversity, the resiliency of our communities, but also creating a narrative of why and what those unmet needs are and how our communities are hurting. I'm looking forward to this discussion. I will say, when it comes to data, if you're not seen, you're not counted. And if you're not counted, you're not seen. And, you know, as just one example, there are a handful of states out there where people who may look like this, I show up as other. And I'd like to, you know, I'm highlighting that because there are so many people out there that deserve to be counted. And again, I'm just very humbled to be a part of this dialogue here with the panelists, but also with everybody here.
Thank you. Guillermo?
So if I can make a long story why I'm here, but I think for me a critical point was after completing my PhD, I studied physics, biology, and neuroscience. I went to the psychiatry department at Cornell University, and I was shocked, and essentially for an intellectual motivation, trying to understand the complexity of the mind. I was shocked by the way psychiatry was practiced. For the lack of a better word, I would say backward compared to what we know and what we can do. And the other inflection point was in the same place, meeting for the first time a mental health patient. And that left a very strong mark. And me, it ceased to be intellectual and it became more personal. What I do now, what we do with our group is precisely try to bring everything that we know in machine learning, artificial intelligence, technology, to better understand the path of a mental health patient and mental health conditions affecting other conditions, chronic pain, recovery from cancer. But what's more important is that we have the possibility now of listening to the patient at home, speaking their mind, and bring that to the healthcare system, right? And I think this is important. And it was highlighted that there are issues with bias in the algorithms. I can tell you a brief anecdote. We were using 10 years ago automated transcription, and I had hired 2 young American ladies, and the system was working better with my voice than with theirs because it was trained with male anchors from the 60s. But I think that's not a problem anymore. Sometimes it's used as an excuse not to do something. We can solve bias problems. We can solve privacy and data handling issues. We can solve that. I think the problem is that what to do with it, right? So we have the possibility of accessing, listening to the patient daily at home. Now we have to do something with that, right? And I think it will be interesting to discuss that.
Thank you for that. So first, just thank you for all of you for starting off with story and narrative and the importance of that. I think for an audience like that, we get the importance of the foundation of telling stories, of our experiences, moving beyond actually the data in terms of, or maybe frame it a different way. Those stories are data too, right? However you want to pull it into the narrative, but to make sure that they are elevated and they are centralized and they're critical for many different reasons. One, for I think a space of validation, a space of healing from my perspective. And also, I think a space of, again, shifting and holding other people accountable to narratives that they may not have ever heard or ever been exposed to. And so I want to thank you all for that piece. So in this work, what I've noticed, and especially since post the public murder of George Floyd, lots of commitments to equity, as all of us have experienced and have seen happen. A lot of folks motivated to do work around equity. However, the work they're not doing, oftentimes are not rooted in values and values that are aligned in how we are to do equity work. And so you all heard Abner mention me earlier, and a lot of work that we've done in the space of innovation, or what we're trying to push, is around having equitable innovation, but it's completely rooted in the principles and the values that we have. And so I wanted to, and Juliet, you were a part of this. Robert Wood Johnson Foundation convened a national commission for transforming public health data systems. And so there was a definition that you all collectively created that listed a whole set of values. And I'll kind of go through them, but values of being accountable, reflects the perspectives of local communities, diverse populations, including people of color, immigrants, people with disabilities, LGBTQ community. Sustainable, fully integrated with healthcare and other sectors, provide data that are disaggregated, comprehensive, and timely. Problem-focused to solution-focused analysis, the capacity to provide knowledge needed to optimize health and well-being for all people, providing tools for racism, facilitate restorative systems that respect all communities, including the sovereign right of tribal nations to govern data, protecting individuals' privacy, security, and guard against unintended consequences. Those things I would imagine most of us are pretty on board with, but what I want to hear and what I would love for you to discuss is to share more about your own core values as you do your work. what are the ones that you tend to lead with as you think about the consideration of centering people as that's a value, but what are the ones that you lead with to do your work, especially in the space of data and research? And again, I'm going to, there's, you know, people who know me, I'm going someplace, but I think we have to ground in values. Julie, I'll go first with you.
Sure. Gosh, how much time do we have? You know, again, as the daughter of immigrant, and I'm saying this not just for this audience, but a broader audience. And as you stated, since George Floyd's murder, I think our country is experiencing a modern chapter of racial equity. And when there's that kind of energy, it also stirs the other side of the energy. So just the intensity of hatred out there also, I am very worried about. But going back to core values, for me, I would say centering Black lives, centering all lives, and creating the space to be together in community and allyship. I also think it's important to create space to allow folks to step out and say that they too are still learning and evolving. I want to underscore that because especially in the Asian immigrant community, especially first generations, this term Asian American, it doesn't translate. And it's been an interesting learning journey for me as well, because when we have the quote unquote in community conversations, my challenge and privilege is to try to talk about why coming together in solidarity with one another, with Blacks, with Latinos, with the disability community, with LGBTQ plus communities. That is a very challenging discussion to have within immigrant communities. And so I do like to underscore, like, creating the space for everyone to be able to come forward and share what they know, but also feel comfortable stating what they don't know and what they may need some help with. I hope we'll get a chance to talk about this a little bit, but with the core values, I would ask, you know, again, I'm one of those DC folks. How many folks are familiar with the White House Executive Order on Equity? Okay, so I see a few hands. If you don't, and I like to share homework assignments with people. I would ask you after the session to just Google White House Equity Order and download a copy in case we lose that downloadable copy. But when a White House, and it's the first equity order a White House has issued, I think it's also tying this to your question, like, how do we lead and where do we lead from? I think it's so important to see what the White House is stating, and in our personal and professional spaces, like, what can we do to amplify that's being messaged through the White House? There's still a lot more work to be done, of course, but I also think it's very, very important. Documentation matters. So please, if you don't have a copy of that executive order, take a look at it, read it, see how it can apply to your own organization, even some of your own personal work.
Thank you. Guillermo?
Well, I think that the way I would frame how I incorporate let's say a moral judgment on what we do, I think the best way for me to describe that is that we are trying, I am trying, and we are trying with my group to not treat the patients as a point in the graph, right? And how to incorporate that. At the end of the day, given what we do, we need to provide statistics and we need to provide description, but you know, I cannot give names, but you know, we have several large ongoing clinical trials, and the natural inclination of people who decide to run these clinical trials is to treat the patient as a point in the chart, and forgetting the entire context, which, practically speaking, is infinite complexity of a person. But between that and the single point, there is a lot of room for development of ideas, how to incorporate the context, what's going on with the person on a daily basis, in order to have better assessment and better treatment. And I think that informs everything that I'm doing, at least with in the context of these ongoing clinical trials, and how we develop tools to address that gap between the infinite complexity of the person and just one point in the chart.
Thanks for that. And just to dig a little deeper, in terms of, and earlier it was mentioned in terms about history and the importance of history and knowing your history as an institution. As you see, you mentioned clinical trials as an example and the ability to be able to engage. And so what is it that you know about the history of your institution that you've been able to either leverage or have had to address in order to engage people and center people in a way that they may not have been before, and potentially do not trust, the institution for whatever history may be there? Can you just talk a little bit about that context as well? Because I often see, and I'm at the AMA, like, a lot of people know our history, but if you don't, AMA, this is recorded. So there's we have our history of racist policies and practices. That is absolutely explicit. I don't shy away from saying that. Sometimes I say we're the poster child, we can be the poster child of racial injustice in medicine at certain points, and excluded Black physicians, and for over 100 years until civil rights was passed. And that's just one example. I think it's really important, and I have had to have this knowledge stepping into this position. And when I step into a room or a space or a place, that history comes with me, whether I want it to come with me or not. And I have to find ways to address it. And so that's kind of what I'm asking in the question of knowing that, it's a large institution, and we can, Dr. Betancourt, you can chime in as well at the same time, but I just wanted to kind of dig a little bit further on how we work through the histories of our mostly historically white institutions to work through engaging people in meaningful and equitable ways.
Well, I can give one answer based on the experience that we have gathered in recent years. And if you, by institution, we call the medical, the medical complex, something that we see systematically is a gap between what people report at home and what people report in the clinic. Right? The same type of question in the clinic in front of the white coat, the answer is very different. And I'm not saying that it's wrong, but you have to factor that in, that the institution is part of the context, right? And the patient at home in the daily context, and the patient in the institution, in the clinic, in front of the authority person, the responses are very, very different, right? And it's not clear how to address that. I think we are propagating that with the organizations we work with, and at least now we are aware of that, right? So what to do with it is not clear to me, but that making that aware and even quantifying it, I think is a very important step.
Thank you. Dr. Betancourt, what are strategies that, so I know you're aware, and what are strategies that you've used or employed or adopt, embody in order to address that history?
Yeah, I mean, I think, we have to acknowledge that all of our institutions, some have better records than others, but the records of how we've grown this nation has been on the backs of, racism, segregation, and healthcare medical experimentation, and the list goes on and on. Those vestiges are still, more invisible to some, acutely painful to others, but they play out today. We see it. And, referring back to New York and the AMA, of which you've done incredible groundbreaking work. I mean, the types of things we're seeing today, we would have never thought possible, right? But I'd say that, fundamentally, this plays out in a lot of different ways. And in urban areas, it plays out with still medical segregation, in different ways by payer, quote unquote, race blind. But we know that the history of racism has led to that concentration of segregation, poverty, the social determinants, which have become a very, it's kind of sterile and very nice term, is, I often tell people don't choose to live on the other side of the tracks. There's a lot of deliberate policies over time that have led us to where we are. And so we politely talk about social needs and the social determinants. So how do we kind of center really not only health in all policies, but equity in all policies? And I think, I'm going to bring in the values question, because I went into healthcare certainly because I believe that my values of wanting to help others were aligned with this idea that healthcare wants to help people. But clearly our history tells us that we failed in so many ways, because it's people who shape the institutions and could twist the values, even though the institutions, quote unquote, may have values up on the wall. And that history is played out. So I think the way we've tried to do it over time is to really kind of ground ourselves in first principles, try to be thoughtful kind of from a political place and from a packaging place as to how we get people to move. It is about, our values end up being more about relationship building, about building trust, about taking people into deep water that might make them feel uncomfortable, but letting them know we're going to do this together and making that progress. Now, in some institutions, who have you have like Hopkins where Tuskegee is front and center. I mean, Henrietta Lacks is front and center. Then they got to really deal with that, or Cone Health, or, Tuskegee. But look, every institution's got their Tuskegee. Every institution's got their Cone Health. They just may not have documented it. The truth of the matter is that centering those values and saying, look, we need to aspire to high quality care for everyone, and getting back to data, you cannot manage what you don't measure. This isn't about like, oh yeah, we deliver equitable care, but then you don't have the courage to measure your performance. That's the conversation we've been trying to have. And I think we've evolved it over the years. My colleague Brian Spendley's here, who led the IOM report on equal treatment, now celebrating 20-year anniversary. We really drove those concepts early on. And I'd say that those recommendations are as good today as they were 20 years ago, because there's a lot of unfulfilled promises and unfulfilled work still there yet to be done. So, and a combination of history, values, and kind of the blueprint that we have that's really, I think, requires action. And that's the title of this conference, right? So.
Absolutely, and thanks for that. I guess building on that, because I'm trying to get a lot of folks in the room here. We have a context. We do equity work, and I want to kind of push it. And when we open for questions, y'all can push the conversation, because I want that to happen. I don't want it to feel as if a lot of this, we all experience, but it's that experience of having to experience it and what to do and how to manage through it. Oftentimes is what we need usually support on, and to hear other ideas of how people are working with their institutions to actually push them to understand the importance of these values in doing this work, and kind of what are those strategies that you've employed to get something done when typically you can't do it, a particular way. Because you walk into a room, we're pushing people all the time. Our presence pushes people. It ignites people in not always good ways. And so I want to, get to that point. And so what are some of, as we think about the context of centering people who are marginalized and historically colonized, what are some of the pitfalls and the kind of unintended consequences that can happen, that tend to happen, that we don't consider as we're doing this work? I think about extraction of energy and exploitation as well of people, as it becomes the jargon of we need to center. There's another side to that could have some consequences, and I just wanted to talk about that a little bit, how you're managing those consequences and moving your teams and people through that. Anybody can start.
Sure. So I couldn't help but. So I also want to say this out loud. We're all advocates, right? We all have that DNA. And this work is exhilarating. I don't know if we can call it work, but this effort is exhilarating. And it's also emotionally, mentally exhausting. with COVID, and also just this, there is that modern chapter of hate that's unfolding. To your question, I also want to sort of lean on, before the Obama administration, I spent 5.5 years at the American Red Cross running disaster relief operations. And so going back to your question, I would say with the values or strategies, and you kind of saw it, and thank you for reading some of the values from the RWJ Data Commission. I think having principles, guiding principles and values is so important. But when you craft that, you have to craft it in a way and ask the question, can everybody see themselves in those words that are being written down? And that's actually a really tough exercise to do, especially when you do convene so many diverse stakeholders. I think a challenge, right, to get to the challenge piece, at the Red Cross, I will say, I reached the level of, disaster executive team. I was the only woman. I was the only person of color. Actually, I was the only unmarried person too. And sometimes that brings out a couple of laughs, but it's also a lifestyle issue, right? So if I said, I need to go home to go buy some groceries, my colleagues didn't understand, why are you taking an hour off? And I would say, well, unless you want to ask your spouse to go get my groceries too, right? I need you to also meet me and get to really know me. And at the Red Cross, this is post priority. I had the opportunity to influence some of our strategic community partnerships, and it was all about building as big of a tent as we could. And that was, I want to say honestly, that was both a personal and professional strategy for me, because as much as I loved my work, and I think the Red Cross is one of the best humanitarian organizations out there, it was a very lonely walk doing that work. So I would say build a tent as big as possible, bring folks that are outside and bring them in so that you're sustained in our leadership work and our community work. But also when we're creating initiatives and partnerships, I would say I learned this both through some successes and some mistakes. When you create a new partnership, there is so much hope there that I think you also have to manage expectations and really do some thought assessment of whatever initiative we're creating. Can we forecast that we're going to sustain this? Because there's nothing like sharing words and then ending your effort with broken promises, because then, the trust is even further broken. So I would say build a big tent for the community, but also for you. And whatever you do engage in, making sure that your efforts can be done, you're committed to doing it in a sustained fashion.
Joseph?
I think we throw the term around a lot, in very broad and unstructured ways around community engagement. I think it becomes a catch-all term for a lot of different things done in very well ways and very check-the-box ways. And the truth of the matter is, if I think about our work and kind of trying to change a healthcare system, the way we engage community is critical, but I think it became more critical when we're able to get people to understand that really what we're trying to do when we look at equity is a doorstep to bedside and back approach to equity and across the entire care journey. That then gives people agency and community to kind of both provide input on where we go, provide a sounding board for what we're doing, and to do that in a meaningful way. I mean, we've all been involved in countless efforts, and it takes work to do real community engagement. And there's not always alignment, and it may not work for a lot of different reasons. But how you build those relationships and hopefully have more wins with community than losses, and by losses I mean like we just can't go in that direction, but that's, we're going to try to get back to that. I think that's been our journey. We have the, the things like our community advisory board. We're getting ready to build a big new building. We're going to push out $62 million that our community advisory board is going to direct due to, guidelines around non-profits, which is incredibly exciting. That, to me, that is the purest form, the highest form of engaging community. This is a group of external community stakeholders who are getting to decide where $62 million go, to what organizations, to what topics. That to me is like the pinnacle of community engagement. Community decides where this money goes. But on the day-to-day around quality of care, these other things, I mean, then you start to dilute the impact of community inside the house. And so trying to constantly figure out ways to kind of leverage communities, different places, I think is really important, but to do it in a meaningful way, because people in the community very quickly know when you're kind of bringing them along versus their input's really being used in some meaningful way.
Thanks for that. I also think we have to shift our framing around even just the words community. I push against my staff from saying it all the time. We're a community. As health, it creates a power dynamic when we frame folks, and I think people in that way. And we have to challenge our narratives. And I actually think the pinnacle of how we work with people that are not in our institutions, that don't have the same amount of, when I say power in terms of decision-making power, in terms of what's happening in their neighborhoods or money, is what is the opportunity that not only are you allowing people to make decisions over the money, but how is it also helping them build wealth, right? And we don't talk enough about and do enough. There's budding work around, the connections clearly between health and wealth. But we have to find more opportunities for people to have wealth building asset kind of managed. I'm talking about like capitalism, like getting into that system. How are we supporting folks to be founders and developers who have the ideas, who are in neighborhoods? They're getting capital for the solutions that they already have that they've had ideas for a long time, and building from that space.
Yeah, I'd say this anchor strategy, we see a movement now with anchors, right? Healthcare institutions as anchors, and their spend and how they use that spend locally and how they leverage that spend to address this exact thing, right? To kind of power up small businesses, minority-owned businesses locally in their catchment area, as opposed to, sending out resources to places far and wide that don't do that. So I think the anchor is this anchor movement and this large anchor network is another kind of hopeful piece in this puzzle.
I agree. And then the last thing that I'm going to open up to questions. This is another kind of framing and narrative. So Brookings, and I think some of you know Andre Perry, who's at Brookings possibly, released a report, and what they did differently. Again, it's a narrative shift about not just about people's needs, the needs of people in the spaces and places of which we serve, but what are the strengths and the assets? And how do we look at data from a design perspective, from a methods, from an interpretation perspective, and looking at the strengths and assets of community. So the report that they put out, as an example, released data of kind of where are the places of which Black people are healthiest and doing well. And so it's really, we really build ourselves as individuals, people, communities, families, based on our strengths, not on our deficits as much. And how do we kind of shift to those models and what needs to happen so that we're doing more strength-based, asset-based approaches? It's just like clinical trials. We know a lot about the gaps, but who is it that's actually going to clinical trials? Why are they going? And maybe some of that data is out there. Or I think about folks who have been incarcerated, right? And we tend to look at the 66% or so who go back, but what about that 33%? What's happening in their lives to keep them out of spaces? So I think there's a frame of, how do we look at what's the strengths, who is surviving, and building from there kind of in our approaches as it relates to equity. So I just wanted to hear any comment around that.
I can start commenting. So it was one of the questions that you prepared in advance regarding who's in the room when we design, a clinical trial, an experiment, a data collection. And I think what I see as something positive is that more and more there is a push for including patient advocacy groups in the room, right? I know that for instance, in Canada, I think it's mandatory now to do that. And that's a way of incorporating the strength and incorporating the knowledge that the research community in particular doesn't have in the design of the data collection, design of the experiments. And I think that we should have much more of that, right? And hopefully this type of forum can help promote the idea that we need that from the get-go, to have that perspective of, for instance, who are we likely to catch, and if we want to recruit in a clinical trial, and who we are likely not to catch in a clinical trial, and how to avoid that problem. I think that is a very important and actionable item that will have a big impact in the way we collect the data.
I wanted to just briefly add, because I know we're winding down, just bringing you more information from Washington, D.C. Believe it or not, there is this group called the White House Data Equity Working Group. Now, doesn't that sound very fun and sexy? But again, I do want to highlight it for those of you that work in the data space. Maybe you are with corporations or entities that have a government relations team. You can carry the message back to them. What really is astounding, and actually I do get excited about this, the White House Data Equity Working Group, again, it stems from that equity executive order that I mentioned, but a few things that I wanted to highlight, and this is where I think some of the institutional transformation is going to happen, because the way data is collected right now, it's broken. But the 3 priorities, and this was just issued April 2022, is making sure that we generate disaggregated statistical estimates to characterize experiences of underserved groups. I mean, I've never heard that kind of language or phraseology in the federal government. Number 2, increasing non-federal research and community access to the disaggregated data. That is, I think it's going to take us many years, but that's a monumental statement. And number 3, conducting robust equity assessments of federal programs to identify areas for improvements. That doesn't sound so big, but part of this equity group is also chaired by the chief statistician of the United States. And they've already assessed and figured out there are 13 federal agencies that collect data in one form or another. And they've made a commitment through this White House that, you know what, we need to get together and figure out how we collect better data, disaggregated data, so that we can all see ourselves in it. And I think that is going to really make a monumental change. It'll take us, I think, several years to get there. But having that kind of federal framework, there is, some states will follow these good trends and other states won't. But again, please read that executive order and share some of this information with your other colleagues as well.
Thank you. I'm going to open up for questions, but I think it's going to take a lot of solidarity amongst people who are doing this work to fight and to push up against the many forces that are going to want to keep the status quo, and not even just keep the status quo, to make sure that we're not even collecting any of this data that we're starting to see, we've been seeing in terms of the movement to shut this type of thing down. Questions, comments, anything? Yes. And I have the after lunch crowd. I see y'all eyes. Like, it's all good. Don't worry. I understand. I feel you. Go ahead. Yes. Yes, please. Absolutely.
Okay. Thank you very much. So my question goes precisely in terms of alliances, but I just wanted to acknowledge Dr. Choi.
It's just Juliet.
Oh, Julia. Yeah,
I have a
Julia.
JD, not an MC. Just Juliet. Juliet's
Okay.
good.
I want to acknowledge that because you're so DC. I love it because I can hear exactly what I also work in DC, so I know what you're saying. And more than just being DC is that we all, as you said, are advocates. That's something, not only advocates of our own communities, but of this group. As I mentioned, I'm Mexican, but I work for Native Americans. But I also support my Black neighbors, and I also support Pacific Islanders. We're all in versus something that we call mainstream. and so we all can be advocates for each other as well. So that's something that I see where you're going with the White House equity workforce, because we work on that, and there is precisely that partnership and alliance. I wanted to ask you, more than commenting, how you see that and who you see that being formed of, in addition to us. Because if I come and ask each one of you, what are your data needs? I'll get a flood of things, such as like elder care, youth care, disabilities, all of these people. I can tell you, I need data for this, and this, for the Native Americans, and like people who are hyper marginalized. And so I think we all could say, that. But what are the components in society that could help us get there, so that it doesn't become a task for the other side? And with the other side, I'm talking about mainstream, which is the hate that you are talking about. I am also very concerned. The more we advance, the more hate we face. And it's very concerning as a new citizen in this society to see. It's very scary to see that I have become part of a society that is so divided. So, who do we have to partner with in order to get that alliance, so that the task doesn't become, so that the this work that we do doesn't become a task? As soon as it becomes a task, then we get that hate. I hope it made sense.
You like that?
It was a DC question.
What's it
I thought it was a DC question. I'm north of DC.
He said he felt left out. No.
I can answer a Boston question for you, a New York City question. No, I'm kidding. I mean, I think, look, this work over 20 some odd years is required. We've all interacted in some way, shape, or form. There's so much to touch here. And it does require a lot of different partnerships. And the data stuff, you said it's not sexy. I use that term too. It's not sexy, but God bless that work, because without that, I don't know who the chief statistician is of the U.S. I'm thankful for him or her, which is great. But the bottom line is that these partnerships that we've developed over the years, and these are people who dip in, they dip out. Joint Commission dips in, NCQA dips in, dip out, AMA dips in, OCR dips in. I was thinking of, when we talk about OCR in New York, Tom Perez, led our Office of Civil Rights, in the city, and really kind of started a big movement there around, the clarification of Title VI of the Civil Rights Act and language. I mean, there have been a series of champions who then foster these partnerships, but the partnerships are oftentimes more about people in those organizations and those organizations kind of forming these partnerships naturally. But I think true success happens when, you've heard kind of connections between all this, when you kind of leverage these partnerships. And the question is, you got to be strategic about your partnerships depending on what you want to achieve. So if it's in the data space, you could use legal, regulatory mechanisms. Maybe you get to payers, you get to CMS, right? So the inside outside the beltway game is really, really important. But I think clearly, what happens inside the beltway is very, very important. And I think we're on the cusp of CMS doing some pretty transformational things, around data collection, social needs, SOGI data, race ethnicity data, that has been built over, I'd say years. But now we have a window. So this work can't be done without partnerships. And there's an infinite number of them, but it's the people in the places that make the partnerships, over my experience.
I would just briefly add, and I'm glad you mentioned Tom Perez. So I always like to say, if I'm doing anything well or well enough, it's because I was trained by Tom. He was actually my law school professor for a couple of years. I do want to acknowledge, there is that DC game, but even the White House Data Equity Work Group, just to share a concrete example, as an advocate, I asked, well, the White House was hosting listening sessions. And so it's like, you get an invitation from the White House, right? And you join a call. And now that we can do more things through Zoom, I think it creates the pressure, but also the opportunity to invite more in. But I always ask, who else are you inviting? Who else are you talking to? And literally, that's the question we asked of the White House with the Data Equity Working Group. And our first meeting, it was 30 minutes. And it's like, okay, well, that's not enough. But can you give us a sense of the dimensions of the different communities, right? So going to what you were saying. So there were additional calls and sessions that were hosted that also included, I mean, we haven't talked about the faith-based community or veterans, the intersectionality of all of those dimensions. So I do think, asking the question like you asked very well, who else is invited, right? Is the table setting being done well? Can it improve? And when I can, I like to say, well, if you haven't invited so-and-so, I would like to invite 5 more people to the table. And I would rather push back and somebody tell me, no, you can't do that, Juliet, but at least I can ask the question, try to push the ball forward in that regard.
Thank you. And it's also, and not only inviting, but like where we go to, right? The expectation that people have to come to us is also there's a power dynamic that we tend to push forward a lot. And we don't tend to get to certain places and listen to people that we need to listen to, and we'll continue to be excluded. So, and I have we have like 5 minutes.
I had a question.
Yes, please.
Okay, thank you all so much. I was so excited to see that there was a panel on research and data. My name is Nia Mitchell. I work as a director with the National Birth Equity Collaborative. And I also work as a qualitative and mixed methods kind of researcher and evaluator. And so I know we always talk about like diversifying the healthcare workforce and what that looks like in terms of clinicians and the ways in which the medical industrial complex kind of contributes to who is allowed to and not. And so as a researcher and evaluator, there's another kind of complex, I would say, that impacts our ability to become researchers, evaluators. Now I'm stepping into the quality improvement space, as well as our ability to receive funding for the type of research and evaluation that we know needs to happen, but then also being able to incorporate paradigms, theoretical frameworks, and methodologies that help us think differently about what is data, how to collect it, how to analyze it, and then also what to do with it. And a lot of times that what to do with it means having real actions and transformation in our families and our communities. And so I wanted to know the ways in which your organizations or institutions were helping to contribute to that shift. And if not, what can be done to do so? Thank you.
Thank you.
I could say, so I'm going to talk about data and impact, right? Is that what you're basically asking? How we leverage data to create some type of impact for our families, communities, patients, right? Yes. Yeah, no, there's no doubt. Look, I mean, I just got some additional data. If we look at the numbers around diversity, particularly around Black men, I mean, it's been flat forever and a day, and countless efforts here. A whole nother report from the IOM, also 20 years ago, kind of revisiting this idea of increasing diversity in the workforce in research and among the physician workforce. But I'd say nurses, mental health. I mean, we have a big problem, and we need to really expand. And we've been banging on pipeline for a while and talking about all these things. But part of it is kind of goes to what I was saying before. We get taught what is the standard, and nobody questions what that standard is. And a lot of the conversations around diversity, the undercurrent or the undertone is diversity sacrifices excellence, right? And I think that what we need to continue to drive forward is no, diversity does not sacrifice excellence. We have not done the work to find the talent that's out there and to grow the talent that's out there in a way that, to your point, breaks from the standards of, it could just be quantitative data. No, focus groups, qualitative, the richness of that. So that's the perspectives that certainly I think are that we need to bring, and bringing data to action is bringing it to action in all different ways. So a long way to go around diversifying. We're trying to do some things. I'll give you an example. I mean, recruiting people up to where we are in Boston. There's several challenges with it. Cost of living is a big one. We know, people's comfort with living in our city, given our city's history. People's want to do meaningful work. So we took $5 million and said, we're going to develop a recruitment and retention fund. I'm going to try to recruit you. I'm going to cover 20% of your time to do stuff that's meaningful to you. I'm going to give you relocation, loan repayment. You may have family responsibilities that you're handling that other people aren't handling. I'm going to plug you into the community and different community-based activities to make you feel a sense of community. There's no shortage of creative ideas in doing this. We just haven't put the resources behind it, and we haven't been disciplined to launch these. in a way that are sustainable. A lot of one-offs is a graveyard of great interventions that don't just kind of continue on. So that's the way we're kind of trying to address the diversity piece and kind of really figuring out, as we build a pipeline, where's it leaky? And it's leaky a lot. How do we fill those with resources, accountability, and holding each other accountable for, the weaponization of quotas and targets. These are all things that have been done to limit what we're trying to accomplish, right? And I think fundamentally we're trying to say, no, finding talent requires a certain approach. And that approach does require that you're looking broad and wide, and you need to demonstrate how you're doing that. So, it's untangling all these policies and practices that prevent us from living our values and achieving the things we want to achieve.
Could
So
I just
we're-
add one
We're at the
example?
1 second though. We have 1 minute. Okay, I keep getting the yellow sign, so I just want to make sure that I respect the space and if something else needs to be here. So go ahead, Julie.
Thanks. So following up on your point about questioning the standards, and I love your question, there are universities that are creating new methodologies in terms of collecting data that include hiring people from community organizations to do that kind of data collection, survey collection, inclusive of language, but also comfort of community. So it is changed. It's a new type of methodology. NYU, UCLA are a couple places. I know there are more. But will you please keep asking that question, because it's a terrific question we have to keep in front of us.
Guillermo, any final?
Oh, regarding the diversification, I think, and I didn't mention that before because I was also thinking of an answer to him. I think we need to include, for obvious reasons, as partners, the industry, right? The industry where people can find careers that they cannot find in academia or in other institutions, and I've seen people make great efforts to hire people with diverse backgrounds, but if they don't have the economics means to the Death Valley of a few years as a postdoc with an NIH salary, there's no way that they can have a career because people have to support their families. Be a partner, and then it's also industry has means to affect change rapidly, right? And it's not easy. It's not always easy to engage with industry because there has to be some potential profit. But I think this is what we have to live with. That's part of the solution.
Thank you. Thank you for the panel. I know we're a little over time, and thank you for your presence today. Thank you for your energy and questions as well. And I think the panel will be here a little after if you have any further questions or comments to make with them. But thanks a lot. Appreciate your time.